Many of you have probably never heard the name Robert Harron. But Harron was a pretty famous actor in his day, who got his start as an office boy at Biograph Studios in New York City at the age of 14. Biograph director D.W. Griffith thought Harron had good looks and was charismatic enough for the pictures. This gave Harron the opportunity to work with the famous director as a prolific actor at Biograph. In the following years, he appeared in a number of Griffith films, most notably Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. Shortly after arriving in New York City from Los Angeles, Harron attended a rather disappointing film premiere of the D.W. Griffith film Way Down East on September 3, 1920. Afterwards, he went up to his room in the Hotel Seymour. He had just gotten dressed and was about to set out for his movie studio when, for some reason, he took some other clothes out of a trunk, and a gun fell to the floor and shot him in the chest. There was no one else with him in the room, so he called the manager of the hotel himself, who rushed all the way up to the 9th floor to him. As Harron was first being attended to, he was smiling and joking through the pain, and reportedly said through clenched teeth, "I'm in a devil of a fix. I've shot myself." Despite the hotel manager telling him that his condition was serious, Harron first requested that an ambulance not be called, and that a local physician be summoned instead. But none was available, so he consented to be taken by ambulance. Then, when the ambulance did arrive, Harron refused a stretcher, insisting on being taken down in a chair, but was quickly talked out of it as he was bleeding profusely. He was then taken to Bellevue Hospital. Despite being in critical condition, Harron was immediately arrested after first aid was administered for violation of the Sullivan Act, and was moved to the prison ward. This law made it illegal to possess a private firearm in New York City without a license. An acquaintance quickly paid the $500 bail to release Harron from police custody. The bullet seemed not to have hit any important organs, but Harron was still losing a lot of blood. He languished in the hospital for a few days before dying on September 5th, after being in critical condition continuously from the moment he had arrived. He was only 27 years old. It was unclear why exactly Harron had a gun in the first place, one theory being that he had used it recently in a movie. Another account stated that Harron himself had said, while injured, that he had put the gun in his suitcase to take it away from his younger brother, and had forgotten that he had put it there. As might be expected, there was public speculation and gossip about this incident. One theory was that Harron was depressed over relationship struggles with actress Dorothy Gish and had committed suicide. Family and friends refuted this story, in part because he was a practicing Catholic who regarded suicide as a sin. In the end, it was ruled an accidental death, and that is the most probable explanation. Harron died in between the filming and release of his last film, Coincidence, which was released the following year. This has been cited as the first time that a film production company had to figure out how to handle an actor's bizarre and publicized death prior to releasing a film. The movie being a comedy, however, the production company, Metro Pictures, did not emphasize Harron's role so that it wouldn't ruin the atmosphere, and it was released with little fanfare. Harron had only recently signed a contract with Metro, and Coincidence was his first and last movie with the company, and unfortunately, it is now a lost film. Olive Thomas started out as an artist model after winning a beauty contest in New York. She got married at the young age of 15 and got a divorce 4 years later. She joined the Ziegfeld Follies and had an affair with Florenz Ziegfeld before going into the movies. She is now probably best known for her performance in the 1920 movie The Flapper, which was the first movie in the US to feature flappers by name. In early September 1920, Thomas and her husband, Jack Pickford, brother of actress Mary Pickford, were in Paris on a second honeymoon. Thomas was already planning to go back to Paris after this trip to appear in some stage plays. On September 5th, after a night of partying and a nice middle-of-the-night meal, the couple went back to their room in the Hotel Ritz a little before dawn. Intoxicated, Thomas accidentally drank a lethal dose of mercury chloride, probably thinking it was something else. The substance had supposedly been medicine for her husband, Jack, to treat his syphilis. But whether or not that was its real purpose, or even that Jack actually had syphilis, has never been confirmed. Whatever the case, the chemical burned her mouth on contact, and Thomas would have felt a burning sensation deep within her after swallowing it, causing immense pain. Thomas immediately realized she had made a serious mistake and screamed, "Oh my God," before collapsing. According to Pickford, he was in bed when it happened, and he caught her in his arms as she fell. Pickford called for a doctor, then said he tried to induce vomiting to get the poison out. A doctor arrived, and Thomas's stomach was pumped multiple times, but no progress was made. She was then taken to the American hospital just outside of Paris. She lost her ability to see and speak, then her kidneys failed, and she lapsed into a coma. The 25-year-old Thomas died on September 10, 1920, 5 days after drinking the poison. And those 5 days had been excruciating. Yet again, there was public speculation and gossip. Some suggested foul play, and that Jack Pickford had poisoned her. This was because it was revealed that Pickford and Thomas's relationship had been on the rocks, and the trip to Paris had been one last attempt to save their marriage. Different accounts say that Thomas, drunk and tired, had thought that the little bottle contained either sleeping pills, prescription nerve tonic, or drinking water, but it's unclear which she thought it was. It was also reported that the bottle had been clearly labeled, though the label had been in French, which she couldn't read. The most persistent of the rumors was that of cocaine orgies, which Pickford denied. This incident and the wild speculation surrounding it was one of the earliest examples of a true Hollywood scandal, even if it was a smaller one. Though media attention would soon turn to the much bigger Fatty Arbuckle scandal the following year. Ultimately, Thomas's death was ruled accidental, and her funeral was held on September 29th. Her last movie, Everybody's Sweetheart, was released posthumously less than a month after her death. The filming for it had already been completed. Thomas's mother, apparently not doing well financially, sold off her daughter's things at an auction. Olive Thomas remains a somewhat obscure actress, but she can still be appreciated for her performance in her most well-known movie, The Flapper, which can easily be found online. Silent film actress and model Virginia Rappe would probably have been forgotten if it had not been for her involvement in the Fatty Arbuckle scandal of 1921. On September 5, 1921, Rappe was invited by a man in Arbuckle's entourage when he saw her in another hotel near the St. Francis, where the Arbuckle group was staying for a party. Rappe accepted and went to their hotel rooms. They were using a few different rooms that people would come in and out of. From there, the details become a bit foggy, partly from the haze of drunkenness and partly from differing witness testimonies. According to Arbuckle, over the course of the night, Rappe became very intoxicated and began vomiting profusely and tearing at her clothes. She was subdued and a doctor was called. After spending a few more days in the hotel room attended by a doctor, she was taken to a hospital, where she died on September 9th. Because of the mysterious circumstances of her death and the association with Arbuckle, who was a huge movie star in Hollywood at the time, it started a media frenzy. The man who performed the autopsy concluded that the cause of death was a ruptured bladder and was partly due to peritonitis. One often cited explanation is that she had been suffering from an untreated bladder infection for a long time, which was made worse when she drank alcohol. After drinking a lot, she experienced an intense burning pain, and this, coupled with the effects of intoxication, could have explained her strange behavior. And drinking to excess might have caused her bladder to rupture, leading to her death. However, the forensic pathologist also believed that the rupture of her bladder had been caused by, quote, some external force. The media and the public had their own theories. The murky, booze-soaked chronology of events made speculation very easy. And to add an extra layer to the case, one of the witnesses at the party, Maud Delmont, who was one of Rapé's acquaintances, declared Arbuckle to be guilty of causing Rapé's death. But Delmont also had a history of blackmailing rich men under similar circumstances to the Arbuckle situation. She was ultimately deemed an unreliable witness. Those who believed that Fatty Arbuckle was guilty of raping and killing Rapé could easily claim that he showed signs of wanting to save his own skin, and for that reason, his testimony might be unreliable. The argument against Arbuckle said that, while forcing himself on her, his large body had crushed her bladder. I won't go into the details about this or the other theories, but they range widely, some rather far-fetched, and nearly everything being very graphic. So I have to choose my words a bit carefully when talking about some of the details, or else this video has absolutely no chance of staying monetized. One of the stories involves Arbuckle putting a Coke bottle somewhere in Rapé. I think you can guess where. But that one is probably not true. Rapé's manager later testified, very embarrassed, that Arbuckle told him and others that he had put some ice in the same place as the alleged Coke bottle. Arbuckle's defense did admit that this was true, but that it had actually been an attempt to help Rapé in a rather unconventional way. There are a lot of factors to consider, including Rapé's exact cause of death, but nothing has been conclusively proven, and probably too much time has passed to get a 100% correct answer. Key details in Arbuckle's testimony changed in the course of the following trials, and this could have been due to his original malicious intent, or simply a misguided attempt to appear less suspicious and clear his name. The slew of gossipy articles written about the circumstances of Rapé's death only served to muddy the waters even more. Some stories in these kinds of articles were completely made up or wildly speculative, but they satisfied a certain section of the public who had a morbid craving to read about all the lurid details. And they also gave moralists more ammunition to rail against the immorality of Hollywood. At the trials, there were so many differing opinions. Witnesses chosen by the prosecution and the defense painted very different pictures of the two parties involved. Rapé's side tried to demonize Arbuckle as a monster disguised as a jolly comedian. Arbuckle's side attacked Rapé's reputation by labeling her a loose woman. It was very ugly all around. The case was one of the biggest media frenzies of the decade, and the first to cause real damage to Hollywood's reputation. The pressure was so severe that Hollywood imposed censorship on itself in order to improve its standing with those who expressed moral outrage at the case, and to avoid federal censorship. Ultimately, Arbuckle was acquitted, but despite this, his career was ruined. Hardly anyone wanted to be openly associated with a person that had so much baggage. Some in the industry said that he was a sacrificial lamb of sorts, so that the movie industry could recover from all the negative pushback. He made some B-movies under a different name in his later years, but stayed away from the limelight out of necessity. Whatever the truth may be, Virginia Rappe is now known almost exclusively for her death, and the effects of it would be widespread and far-reaching in the American movie industry. After the deaths of Robert Harron, Olive Thomas, and especially Virginia Rappe and the controversy surrounding Fatty Arbuckle, there was yet another mysterious death involving a famous movie person, the third year in a row of such a publicized death involving the movie industry. This time, the victim was William Desmond Taylor, a famous director and actor. On the night of February 1st, 1922, Taylor spent time in his Hollywood home casually chatting with actress Mabel Normand starting around 7 p.m. At around 7:45, Normand got into her car and her driver drove her away. She said they had arranged to talk by telephone later that night, but Taylor's call never came. An estimated 15 minutes after Normand left, Taylor was shot inside his home. Taylor's neighbor, actor Douglas MacLean, and his wife reported hearing a loud sound like a car backfiring around 8 p.m., which would have been very close to the time that Mabel Normand said she left the house. They also said they saw a strange man about that same time. Taylor was shot in the left side of his back, about elbow length high, and the gun had been fired at a strangely upward trajectory at close range, and the bullet ended up in the base of his neck. At the time of his murder, it looked like Taylor had been working on his checkbook at his desk. It was considered a strong possibility that the killer may very well have been hiding in ambush inside the house. Taylor's body wasn't discovered until the next morning by his valet, Henry Peavy, where it was lying next to his desk. Peavy reportedly shouted, "Murder! Murder!" and the police were called. There was little physical evidence found in direct relation to the murder, but quite a bit that might possibly have been related, though nothing important seemed to have been taken from the house, which meant that the motive had likely not been robbery. Backing up this conclusion was the fact that $78, a 2-carat diamond ring, and a platinum watch were found in Taylor's pockets. The murder quickly became a huge headline in the newspapers. Just like in the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, gossip columns as well as more legitimate newspapers immediately began publishing long articles covering the story. Then, more details of Taylor's personal life made their way into the news. It was speculated that Taylor had had a relationship with the young actress Mary Miles Minter, and love letters she sent him were made public. But many who knew her or Taylor asserted that Minter's love was not reciprocated. Minter was considered as a suspect, and there is some evidence to support this. Of course, there's the motive of the jilted lover. And also, 3 blonde hairs were found on Taylor's clothes. These were compared with known samples of Minter's hair by an expert, who confirmed they were the same. However, forensic science at that time was far from precise, so there's a strong possibility of a mistake. And it doesn't necessarily prove anything even if the hairs were Minter's. It just indicates that maybe she had hugged him or was near him a relatively short time before he was killed. Another suspect was actress Mabel Normand, who, as we know, was the last known person to see Taylor alive, being in his home very shortly before he was believed to have been killed. It also seems that she too had unreciprocated love for Taylor. Love letters written in code by Normand were found in Taylor's home after they had briefly gone missing. Normand said she would gladly allow them to be published if it cleared her of suspicion. While the letters from 29-year-old Normand were embarrassingly similar to a schoolgirl declaring her love, they provided nothing of real interest for the investigation. One sensational explanation for the murder was considered based on testimony from an assistant United States attorney. He said that Taylor had intervened on behalf of an unnamed drug-addicted actress against her dealers, some believing that this was Normand. If true, this could mean that the dealers had Taylor killed before he exposed their lucrative operation. And Taylor's case became even more bizarre after it was discovered that he had led a completely different life previously. In 1908, he had abruptly left his wife of nearly 7 years, his young daughter, and his job as an antiques dealer. Then he had been William Dean Tanner, which was his birth name. After 4 years of his absence, his wife got a legal divorce from him and presumed him to be dead. Some years later, he had become a movie actor, and his now ex-wife saw him on the screen and recognized him. They eventually got into contact again, and it appeared that Taylor couldn't remember his previous life. The exact reason isn't clear, and his memory loss can't really be completely confirmed now, but he had suffered from severe memory lapses before, and could easily have had a massive episode of amnesia or something similar. Conditions like that certainly do exist. To make things even stranger, his brother, Dennis Dean Tanner, had also left his wife without warning and disappeared under similar circumstances. There had been some speculation that Dennis was somehow involved in Taylor's murder, but nothing substantial has been uncovered, and it's very unlikely despite the uncanny similarities in their cases. There was a more promising suspect, a man named Edward F. Sands, who had been Taylor's assistant. The year before his death, Taylor came back from a vacation to find that Sands had stolen some valuable things from him, including jewelry and his car. Then Sands disappeared. He briefly resurfaced to steal more jewelry from Taylor's house, and then disappeared again. To this day, we have no idea what happened to him after that. This mysterious man initially proved to be a likely suspect. There was quite a bit of circumstantial evidence against him, as well as a possible motive. After stealing from Taylor, Sands sent him a message that made it clear that he knew his true identity. The reason why this might be important is that police thought blackmail might have been a motive, and perhaps Sands would have exposed Taylor's secret unless he paid him off. And he had also allegedly threatened to kill Taylor the day before he died. But there were some problems with Sands as a suspect. Sands had seemed keen on stealing from Taylor multiple times before, so why didn't he steal anything after the murder? Another important thing was that Faith McLean, the neighbor, was sure that he wasn't the man she had seen, and she had previously been familiar with him. Another piece of evidence is an alleged spotting of a man looking like Sands far away in Oakland around the time of the murder. But any of those things could simply be mistakes. However, despite witness statements about the person at the scene being described as a man, it was still considered that the killer might have been a jealous or heartbroken woman, perhaps from the movie industry, which was partly why Mary Miles Minter and Mabel Normand had been initial suspects. One theory was that a woman may have been disguised as a man, or at least dressed in a way that made witnesses mistake her for a man. Backing up this claim was Faith McLean's statement that the man she saw outside of Taylor's door at night was funny looking, specifically drawing comparisons to an actress who was dressed up like a man during filming for a movie. There were some other pretty out there theories. One of them was that Dennis Dean Tanner was actually masquerading around as Edward Sands and killed his brother. Even though this was quickly disproven, it demonstrates how this case captured people's imaginations. Other suspects in the murder included Mary Miles Minter's mother, Charlotte Shelby, who may have wanted to protect her daughter or may have been in love with Taylor herself. And then there was Henry Peavy, Taylor's valet and the man who first discovered Taylor's body, as well as actress Margaret Gibson. Allegedly, Gibson even made a deathbed confession to the murder in 1964, but the authenticity of this story is questionable. And it's important to note that this was but one of around 300 reported confessions to Taylor's murder. This scandal had many similarities with the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, with a mix of truth and gossip. Movie people, a sordid affair, murder, and tarnished careers. Both Mary Miles Minter's and Mabel Normand's careers in Hollywood were irreparably damaged by the scandal, despite the fact that they were, and still are, considered unlikely to have been the killer. The case remains unsolved to this day. Like many unsolved murders, there are many people who are practically obsessed with solving the mystery behind Taylor's death, and it's no wonder. Virtually every existing document or testimony has been documented, but it seems unlikely that anything will be definitively proven at this point. There are so many twists and turns to this story that it definitely deserves its own lengthy video. Wallace Reed began making films in Hollywood in 1910 and continued throughout the rest of that decade, even making an appearance in D.W. Griffith's infamous film Birth of a Nation in 1915, sharing the screen with Robert Harron, another ill-fated actor. Reed became a leading figure in the movie star worship of the early 1920s. He was handsome, romantic, and masculine, a big hit among women. He is sometimes considered to be the most popular male screen idol before Rudolph Valentino hit the scene. But with this kind of popularity, there would be a cost, and Reed would eventually pay with his life. In 1919, Reed was making a film with Paramount Studios called The Valley of the Giants. While on the way to the filming location, he was seriously injured in a train accident. He was given morphine to ease the pain, and the filming proceeded. At the time, this was a common treatment, especially in Hollywood. The problem was, with morphine, like some other drugs, a person eventually acclimated to it, which meant that it required a higher dosage to feel as effective as before. It didn't take long before Wallace Reed was completely addicted to morphine, and was reliant on it to be anywhere near useful for making movies, and his health was quickly becoming a problem. It started to affect his personality too. The normally easygoing Reed became irritable, and sometimes behaved erratically. To help ease his frustration, he also started drinking more. The studio eventually cut him off from morphine, but he easily got more on the black market. Not only was he addicted, but this was Hollywood. A long break from movies could mean the end of his career, and the pressure of the environment of the movie industry must have been immense. And if he did receive a lengthy recovery time, people would probably prod into the matter, and possibly uncover the truth, something that had the potential to further damage Hollywood's reputation after the Fatty Arbuckle scandal in 1921. Despite his worsening condition, he was pushed to keep up his busy schedule. He lost a lot of weight and had outbursts of anger. By December 1922, he had lost 60 pounds since his injuries, and was too weak to do any more filming. His wife, actress Dorothy Davenport, finally persuaded him to go to a Hollywood sanitarium that month, but it was too late. He slipped in and out of comas, his immune system too weak to fight off infections. On January 18, 1923, he died from complications of pneumonia at the young age of 31. Dorothy wrote to her mother-in-law, "The boy simply slept away, died at 1 o'clock today. Our hearts are together." Reed's last feature film, titled 30 Days, is lost, but it was not a success. His bad physical condition was apparently obvious to many theatergoers. Ironically, the last movies where Wallace Reed made an appearance were two films that sought to convince the public that Hollywood was a great place, featuring his and other cameos from many actors and actresses. Perhaps it was seen that way by some, but it was also the same place that indirectly killed Wallace Reed. After his death, as a tribute to him, his wife began billing herself as Mrs. Wallace Reed and turned him into a symbol of the fight against drug addiction. She made a film about this exact topic later that same year. However, neither she nor the media ever pushed the fact that the ruthless Hollywood system was a major contributing factor to his death. Without the crazy schedules and added stress, not to mention his enabled morphine dependency, he might have kicked his addiction, or wouldn't have had it in the first place. But in the immediate aftermath of his death, Hollywood's role was officially swept under the rug. In the same year of his death, Reed's mother published a short book about his life. In the book, his last months were summed up in the form of letters written to her by his wife, Dorothy, from the sanitarium. A letter from December 10th, 1922 stated that, "Poor Wally had a relapse, and he can't go to work for 2 or 3 weeks yet, but we hope all will be well in a few days." Then, in another letter from December 31st, "Wally is improving every day, and he hopes to be back at work in 6 weeks." In hindsight, it's a little disturbing how much emphasis was placed on him getting back to work, even in his final languishing months. The letters also talked about how he looked much younger and healthier, which couldn't possibly have been true of a man less than a month away from dying of drug addiction and illness. The book didn't directly mention drug addiction or his hectic work schedule. It focused more on his likable personality, though sometimes vaguely mentioned certain rumors about him that the reader is apparently already supposed to know about. And this was how he was remembered for many years, a victim of drug addiction, but not of Hollywood. But we know now that without Hollywood's role in all of this, he might have never gone down that path to destruction. This next death involved another famous Hollywood person, and is one of the most famous and mysterious Hollywood deaths of all time. By the 1920s, Thomas H. Ince was a very successful actor turned producer. He had set up a vast studio lot named Inceville in Santa Monica, California, pioneering such practices as storyboard writing prior to filming, film budgeting, and calculating how long it would take to finish a film. He also pioneered the Western as a film genre, and helped to propel Mary Pickford to nationwide fame. But by the early 1920s, Hollywood was changing very quickly. This period saw the beginning of the rise of big studios that were soon to dominate the film industry, and were trying to push smaller studios, like Ince's, out of the picture or buy them out. To try and get around this, Ince sought to befriend William Randolph Hearst, the controversial but very powerful newspaper tycoon. On November 15, 1924, Hearst invited Ince, along with other Hollywood luminaries such as Charlie Chaplin, Eleanor Glynn, Luella Parsons, and Hearst's own mistress, Marion Davies, to a trip to San Diego on Hearst's yacht, Oneida. Ince's 44th birthday was the next day, the 16th, which was used as the excuse for the excursion. The details of what happened aboard the yacht that day are still very cloudy, and made more difficult by various rumors and speculation over the years. What we do know is that Ince became very sick on the second night of the trip, so the yacht stopped at San Diego, where Ince was taken ashore to a hotel, and eventually back to his home in Beverly Hills, where he died shortly after, on November 19th. The details published about the incident varied widely. The location of his death, the cause of death, and exactly who witnessed what were all at odds with each other in different accounts. For example, Charlie Chaplin's secretary allegedly saw a bullet wound on Ince's head as he was being taken off the boat. This supported a common rumor that Hearst was trying to shoot at Charlie Chaplin, but hit Ince by accident. This was because Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, was allegedly Chaplin's mistress as well. Some even thought that the yacht trip was a trap, and that Hearst wanted to catch Davies and Chaplin fooling around together. Then there was the fact that Ince died on November 19th, and his body was quickly cremated on the 21st. Cremation was in accordance with his wishes, but because it was done so soon after his death under suspicious circumstances, it only fueled rumors. It was also rumored that Hearst gave some of the witnesses, including his own wife, bribes so they wouldn't discuss what had happened. But again, it was just a rumor. A less sensational explanation for the cause of Ince's death was a stomach ulcer. A stomach ulcer can have symptoms very similar to those of angina or even a heart attack. So if the attending doctor was unaware that Ince had an ulcer, it could have easily been a simple misdiagnosis when he listed the cause of death as heart failure. But there are reasons why some have an alternative explanation for the misdiagnosis. Like any Hollywood party before, during, and after Prohibition, there was a lot of alcohol. With the crackdown of censorship in Hollywood, all of these celebrities being involved in illegal activities would have been something they wouldn't want to get out. And ulcers were sometimes linked with heavy drinking, so Hearst and Company might have wanted to avoid that connection at all costs. This could account for why the witnesses' details often didn't match. Luella Parsons even claimed that she not only wasn't on the boat, but that she was across the country in New York. This was later disproven. Marion Davies claimed that there was no alcohol on the boat that night. That was also disproven. Interestingly, Davies corroborated Luella Parsons' claim that she wasn't on the boat. She also said that Chaplin wasn't there either. But yes, that was also disproven. But the fact that some of these accounts, like Davies, were from long after Prohibition ended is more than a little puzzling if they were trying to cover up the drinking. The lack of definite facts is frustrating, and because of how much time has passed, there will probably not be any more shocking revelations that have any real effect on the case. So we will probably never get a definite answer about how Thomas H. Ince died, but it was most likely an ulcer or another natural cause. And unfortunately, he is more remembered for his death than for his contributions to the American film industry. The next person was one of the most well-known pop culture figures of the 1920s, someone that everyone watching this video probably knows, Rudolph Valentino, one of the great early male heartthrobs of the movie world. After his breakthrough, he was cast as a Latin lover leading man. He was seen as exotic and sexy, and filled with romantic passion. Valentino was born in Italy, and as a teenager also lived in Paris for a short time. Then he came to the US and was processed at Ellis Island in New York. He worked menial jobs in New York City before he was caught in the middle of a public scandal that called into question his relationship with a married woman, and he was even briefly arrested. To escape such chaos, Valentino ran away to Los Angeles, on the other side of the country. He got married, though it wasn't happy. His breakthrough film was The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in 1921, where he did a passionate tango that made women swoon across the country. That same year, he starred in his iconic film, The Sheik. After these two films, his popularity soared, and there were a few reasons for this. In the 1920s, there was a trend of European movie people coming over and offering something a bit different for American audiences. Valentino's exoticness became a very desirable and valuable trait. He offered an alternative sort of masculinity. In the early 1920s, the image of someone like Douglas Fairbanks was considered to be the ideal image of a man, a real traditional man's man. In his roles in Four Horsemen and The Sheik, Valentino was a romantic and assertive lover. But sensitiveness and passion were also part of his image, which were not typically considered manly at the time. And he even published a book of poetry in real life in 1923. Perhaps other men weren't drawn to him as much as men like Fairbanks, but the practically rabid fandom among women was more than enough to launch his career into the stratosphere, and he became a cultural icon. In late 1922, he went on strike against famous Players Lasky, the movie studio he worked for, partly because he thought his salary didn't equal his now massive popularity, and partly because he wanted more creative control. Because of this, he didn't appear in any films in 1923. Also in that year, he finally divorced his estranged wife and immediately married actress Natasha Rambova. He didn't wait the required 1 year after divorce, so he was arrested for bigamy. This caused yet another scandal in Hollywood when it was still recovering from a series of other very public scandals. When Valentino did finally come back to the movies, the results were disappointing, and his popularity started to decline. Some blamed this failure on the influence of Natasha Rambova. But things began to look up for him in late 1925 with the release of The Eagle, which gave his career a much-needed boost. And his next project sought to bring him back to the top. It was a sequel to his big 1921 hit The Sheik, titled The Son of the Sheik, and Valentino played the role perfectly. The Son of the Sheik might not have been as legendary as the first movie, but Valentino was on his way back up, just as he had hoped. But unknown to him or the public, it would also be his swan song. Shortly after setting out on a promotional tour, he collapsed in his hotel room in New York City. He was taken to a hospital and given emergency surgery for a perforated ulcer and appendicitis. After the surgery, he was conscious and lucid, but there was still anxiety about the next few crucial days of recovery. Telegrams and messages poured in as he languished with a fever that went up to 103 degrees. He seemed to rally after those few days, then quickly plunged into critical condition again as pleurisy developed, which is an inflammation that makes it very painful to breathe. Then he was found to have peritonitis, inflammation of the abdominal membrane, as well as septic endocarditis, an infection affecting the heart, and he lapsed into a coma. His death was expected when it came soon afterward on August 23, 1926, at the age of 31. Reportedly, one of the last things he said was, "Don't worry, Chief, I will be all right." His death caused a massive public reaction, especially from women. Various numbers were reported, but it was said that probably between 80,000 and 100,000 people went to the public viewing before the funeral. Because of the crowd and the strong emotions, there were problems, and more than 100 people were reported to have been hurt, though most were minor injuries, in what was described as a riot. Some windows were smashed, and at least one person was arrested. There were so many people that traffic was held up, and well over 100 additional police officers were brought in to try to control the masses. When the doors to the funeral home opened up, the crowd roughly pushed past the police officers to get in all at once so they could line up for the viewing. As the New York Times reported, nearly half of those in line tried to reach for some souvenir of the occasion, and it was clear that some would succeed and probably ruin the room. So the line was stopped at the lower door, and the coffin moved to a smaller room, one flight up. This roughhousing was so bad that the viewing was extended into the next day. It got to the point where the public was banned from further viewing, and more police were brought in, bringing the total to about 200. People still hung around, but were told not to loiter. Others tried to sneak in. Paula Negri's appearance at Valentino's bier was especially dramatic. She knelt down and prayed for 15 minutes, then said she had been engaged to marry him. She seemed to nearly faint multiple times and had a large flower arrangement spelling out her name displayed at the funeral. Her behavior was too exaggerated for some, who thought she was playing it up for publicity. A second funeral was held later in Los Angeles. Valentino had never made any burial plans for himself, so June Mathis, a Hollywood screenwriter who had worked with him, gave up her own spot in her family plot in the Hollywood Memorial Cemetery. Instead of the temporary arrangement it was intended to be, Mathis herself died the very next year, so Valentino stayed where he was. Mathis was placed next to him. There were many reports of women weeping hysterically, fainting, and, allegedly, some even ending their lives as a result of Valentino's death. One of the most well-known instances was of a 27-year-old woman named Peggy Scott, who was found dead in London surrounded by pictures of Valentino and letters he had supposedly written to her. For decades, a woman in black visited Valentino's grave on the anniversary of his death and placed a rose on it. When this woman died in 1984 and her identity was revealed, her home was found to be filled with Valentino memorabilia. As that story demonstrates, Valentino's death hit some people really hard. It is his tragic death that heavily contributes to his legacy as a Hollywood legend. His career had a dramatic arc worthy of a Hollywood movie. He was quickly shot up into stardom, then fell off, came back for a triumphant return, then died shortly afterward, still young. It makes you wonder, if he hadn't died when he did, would less people today know his name? I guess we'll never know. Calvin Coolidge served as president for the majority of the 1920s, and is closely associated with the decade. He was known as Silent Cal, and while that is a bit of an exaggeration, there was something he was very silent about: the death of his son, Calvin Jr. It all started on a hot day on June 30th, 1924, outside on the south grounds of the White House. The temperature that day rose to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty hot for Washington, D.C. The president's favorite son, Calvin Jr., and his 17-year-old brother, John, were playing a game of lawn tennis. For whatever reason, Calvin Jr. went out wearing shoes but no socks. The press was also there to take photos of the presidential family. Perhaps because of this, President Coolidge wanted his sons to look presentable, as they usually did at home, so they played in wool suits despite the high temperature. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, and everyone went home happy. It was a busy time for President Coolidge, as he was preparing for the Republican National Convention that was less than 2 weeks away, and the upcoming presidential campaign. He had just been officially nominated 2 weeks earlier, and was expected to win an easy victory, as he was quite popular. But with all of this going on, within a few days, it was discovered that Calvin Jr. had developed a blister on the top of his third toe on his right foot. It had been caused by all of the activity during that tennis match, and the blister had become infected and turned dark. The boy was limping, had a fever, was swollen in the groin area, and had red streaks running down his legs. A doctor was immediately consulted, and Calvin Jr.'s condition was quickly recognized as being very, very serious. In time, it would be diagnosed as sepsis, blood poisoning. Antibiotics were still a few years away, so there was little that could be done in terms of treatment. The president was understandably distraught, and was now very distracted from fulfilling his political duties, rushing back and forth from his office to his son's sickbed. Charles Dawes, who was running on President Coolidge's tickets as the vice presidential candidate, happened to be at the White House at this time. As he passed Calvin Jr.'s sick room, he saw the president bent over the bed. He later described what he saw. "I have never witnessed such a look of agony and despair as was on the president's face." The newspapers got a hold of the story, though it was announced that there would be no formal bulletins released by the White House or the Coolidge family. President Coolidge was already a very private man, and this cut deeper into his emotions than anything else before. The president's and the nation's birthday on July 4th were virtually forgotten by the Coolidges. President Coolidge wrote a short letter to his father in Vermont, saying, "Calvin is very sick, so this is not a happy day for me." The next day, Calvin Jr. was transferred to nearby Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he received the best treatment the country could offer. He was given sedatives, and risky surgery was performed in an attempt to drain the poison. And while the operation was a success, it also wasn't certain if it had actually helped. But it soon became very clear that the sepsis was quickly spreading, and further surgery would be futile. And the doctors came to the conclusion that only a miracle could save the president's son. So all they could do was wait and hope. As with many cases of serious illness, Calvin Jr.'s condition improved slightly before taking a sharp, cruel turn for the worse, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. The next day, July 7th at 10:30 p.m., he died, with his parents at his bedside. John had remained at the White House. The news was announced over the radio from Madison Square Garden, and the ongoing Democratic National Convention adjourned out of respect for the president. The effect of Calvin Jr.'s death on his father's presidency was immense, though the president almost never spoke about it directly. But through his personal policy of strict privacy, there were some pretty clear hints at how this affected him. In his short autobiography, he devoted only one line to the matter. "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." It is believed that President Coolidge fell into a deep depression for the remainder of his presidency, and this contributed to his famous decision not to run again in 1928. As for the 1924 election, the wheels of motion were already turning, so he accepted an easy win and 4 more years as president, but had to endure it without his favorite son. He later made a touching comment to a friend about Calvin Jr. that might also double as a sign of his mental anguish at the cause of his death. He said, "When I look out that window, I always see my boy playing tennis on that court out there." On August 16, 1920, the Cleveland Indians were playing the New York Yankees at the Polo Grounds. At the top of the 5th inning, Ray Chapman, nicknamed Chappie, a popular player among Indians fans, was the first batter, pitted against the skilled pitcher Carl Mays, who used a very low submarine delivery, as you can see in this film. The first pitch struck Chapman on the left side of his head. The sound of the impact was so loud that the pitcher, Mays, thought the ball had hit the handle of the bat. This might explain why Mays didn't walk over to check if Chapman was okay, fielding the ball instead. Tommy Connolly, the home plate umpire, noticed blood coming from Chapman's ear and immediately called for a doctor in the stands, and 2 doctors rushed onto the field. The crowd became silent as Chapman was being examined. He stumbled up to his feet with assistance and was walked to the visitors' clubhouse, where he lost consciousness, and was carried the rest of the way by 2 teammates. Although the uncertain fate of Chapman left many fans and players anxious, the game would be finished, with the Indians gaining an important victory on their way to the World Series. Chapman was rushed to St. Lawrence Hospital, located half a mile from the Polo Grounds, where his head was x-rayed. A surgeon, Dr. T.M. Merrigan, made the decision to operate. Here is a description of the injury as reported in the New York Times on August 18th. The blow had caused a depressed fracture in Chapman's head 3.5 inches long. Dr. Merrigan removed a piece of skull about 1.5 inches square and found the brain had been so severely jarred that blood clots had formed. The shock of the blow had lacerated the brain not only on the left side of the head where the ball struck, but also on the right side, where the shock of the blow had forced the brain against the skull. Chapman had his future planned out. If the Indians won the World Series, he would retire from baseball and go into business in Cleveland, and would be able to spend more time with his wife, who he had married only the year before, as well as the child they were expecting. Here is another excerpt from the New York Times. Before the game, the player had placed in the trainer's custody his diamond ring, a gift from his wife. Several times the stricken man tried to say ring, but he could not speak. He pointed to his finger. The operation lasted over an hour, ending at 1:44 in the morning. Chapman would die 3 hours later at 4:40. He was 29 years old and left behind his wife and unborn daughter. Chapman's pregnant wife had been called at the beginning, before the seriousness of the injury was apparent. She arrived in New York at 10 a.m., but it was already too late. A priest who was also a friend of Chapman's took Mrs. Chapman to a hotel to tell her about her husband's death, and she fainted. Chapman's coffin was shown in New York for a few hundred people, including players from the Indians and the Yankees, where it was said, "There was not a dry eye among the scores of men who thronged the room about the bier." Carl Mays, the pitcher who threw the fatal pitch, voluntarily participated in the investigation, and he was recorded as saying, "It is the most regrettable incident of my baseball career. I would give anything if I could undo what has happened. Chapman was a game, splendid fellow." There were suspicions against Mays because he had a controversial habit of hitting batters on purpose, or at least trying to buzz them around the head in order to intimidate them. But Mays claimed that he had stopped doing that, and that that was not what had happened with Chapman. He said that the ball had had a rough spot on it, which made it turn unexpectedly. At that time, there was considerable debate over spitballs, which meant using saliva, dirt, or other substances to make the ball move erratically and unpredictably when thrown by a pitcher. Mays had been notorious for utilizing this technique. Even though Mays obviously hadn't wanted to kill anyone on purpose, not everyone believed that he was entirely blameless, and players from the Boston Red Sox and the Detroit Tigers, among others, called for him to be banned from baseball. The president of the American League, Ban Johnson, decided not to take further action against Mays, believing that it had truly been an accident. The Yankees manager, Miller Huggins, said that he believed Chapman's shoe spike had caught on something in the dirt at home plate, preventing him from moving out of the way of the ball. Indians pitcher Ray Caldwell said that Chapman had seemed to duck into the path of the ball, and if he hadn't moved, he probably would have been hit in the shoulder. Indians player/manager Tris Speaker called for peace toward Mays, saying, "It is the duty of all of us, of all the players, not only for the good of the game, to suppress all bitter feelings. We will do all in our power to avoid aggravating the unfortunate impression in any way." Chapman's funeral was held in Cleveland on August 20th. Carl Mays went into seclusion for a little while, and did not join the Yankees when they went to Cleveland for 3 games. Plans for a memorial for Chapman in Cleveland began immediately, and money was raised through a local Cleveland newspaper. More than 15,000 people donated 10 cents each. A bronze plaque was made and displayed shortly after at the Indians' home field, League Park. In February 1921, Chapman's widow gave birth to their daughter, who she named Ray, spelled R-A-E, almost certainly in honor of the father she would never meet. Immediately after Chapman's tragic death, rules for more safety gear were considered. At least one manager, Pat Moran of the Philadelphia Phillies, distributed protective headgear to his players in 1921, but ultimately the decision was left to each team. Batting helmets were not required throughout Major League Baseball until the 1950s. Unfortunately, there was more tragedy for Ray Chapman's family. His widow, Kathleen, did remarry, but she still suffered from depression as a result of his sudden death. In 1928, she committed suicide by drinking poison. The next year, Chapman's daughter, Ray, died of measles at only 8 years old. But there was a little bit of good news, too. The Cleveland Indians would go on to win the World Series 2 months after Chapman's death, and the team dedicated their victory to him. And most recently, in 2007, the original 1920 Ray Chapman Memorial Plaque was rediscovered, after being completely forgotten in storage for decades. Although the plaque was in poor condition, it was meticulously cleaned and is now on display at Progressive Field in Cleveland, hopefully never to be neglected again. Ray Chapman remains the only Major League Baseball player to die from on-field injuries. Max Linder is a relatively forgotten celebrity today, but he was one of the biggest stars of early film. He was born in Saint-Loubès in southwestern France on December 16, 1883. His family was well off, having a successful vineyard. Instead of taking over the family business, as a young man he went to study acting. In the first half of the 1900s, he found work in small bit parts, usually comedies. He continued appearing in various early shorts for Pathé, eventually taking up the persona of a rich, debonair gentleman named Max. This persona was an influence on Charlie Chaplin, who had not yet begun making films. By 1910, Max Linder was a big star in the burgeoning film world, becoming arguably the first real movie star. At that time, France was still the capital of film, and that meant that Linder's films were being sent off to other countries, making him an international success. The next few years saw the peak of his career, but then came World War I. He was deemed unfit for combat when he tried to enlist, but he was allowed to be a driver, though the extent of his military experience is not clear. According to records, he had 3 separate illnesses just within the span of the first year of the war alone. Speculation about his military service ranged from him never leaving the barracks to the oft-repeated story that he took a bullet to the lung. One unconfirmed story from a supposed comrade states that he had made at least 1 trip from Paris to the front lines. However, regardless of what happened during his service, he was soon abruptly dismissed from duty, though the reasons for that were never explicitly stated. It's likely that it was due to health problems. From then on, he served as an entertainer for French soldiers. It was around this time that he first experienced depression, at least as far as is known. Though there was a rumor during his tour in Moscow before the war that he was gloomy and not friendly if a fan met him on the street. The reasons for his depression are not entirely clear, but the global conflict that was ripping his country apart and killing so many of his fellow countrymen probably wasn't helping matters. He was known to speak of the violence and terror of combat, which, as I mentioned before, he may or may not have actually witnessed. If he had, that might have played a large part. As with quite a few screen stars in later years, some events in Linder's life might have been exaggerated or entirely made up, by himself or by others. But one can't help but think that lying about war experiences, especially at that time, would have been in very bad taste and would have been a very risky career move. Linder moved to the United States to try his hand at making movies there, and stayed until the summer of 1918. His films with SNA Studios weren't too successful, though he had befriended Charlie Chaplin while he was there. Linder went back to Paris, made one more film there, and eventually moved back to the US a few years later, in 1921. But ultimately, he moved back to France in the summer of 1922. In an interview in the months before leaving, he was quoted as saying something that went under the radar at the time. He said, "I exercise how to be cheerful and happy every morning. I sing loudly, I whistle, I dance, and I'm sad, sad infinitely." The films he made in America were quite good and were moderate successes at the box office, but not nearly enough to regain his popularity from the pre-war years. After he returned to Europe, he made 2 more films, the last being filmed in Austria. By this time, it was becoming obvious that something was wrong with Linder. His depression had taken a turn for the worse, making it difficult for him to perform. On August 2nd, 1923, he married Elaine Peters, usually called Nanette, who was 20 years younger than him, being only 17 when their relationship was first discovered earlier that same year. Nanette's mother actually accused Linder of kidnapping her underage daughter when they went off to Nice together. Nanette was also the heiress to her father's restaurant fortune, so together she and Linder were quite wealthy. You might think that a beautiful, young new wife and more money would help him feel better, but it was said that Linder didn't look very happy at the wedding, and a rumor circulated that he had been forced into it for some reason. A mere 6 months later, on February 24th, 1924, Linder and Nanette were found unconscious in their hotel room in Vienna, Austria, both under the influence of Veronal, a barbiturate commonly used as a sleep aid at the time. This was publicly declared an accidental overdose. Linder claimed he had been taking Veronal habitually at night so he could fall asleep, and had developed a tolerance to it. Less than a week later, Linder went back to filming his latest and last film, which was the reason why they were in Austria in the first place. To make this whole situation worse, Nanette had been pregnant at the time of the near-death experience, because in June 1924 their daughter Maud was born, but she was a healthy baby. Just to clarify, Linder's bad mood at the wedding couldn't have been related to the pregnancy, because there were 10 months between the wedding and the birth of Maud. While the birth of their daughter should have been good news for the couple, it probably only added more stress to their relationship, and it was becoming more and more obvious, especially to Nanette, that Linder was not just depressed, but very mentally disturbed. This had been foreshadowed earlier when Linder had agreed to an interview with a man from a British film magazine. Everything was going fine until Linder was asked about his impending marriage. Instead of answering, he stood up, took out a revolver from a drawer, and slowly started loading it up with a few bullets. The interviewer was so disturbed by these strange actions that he quickly left. Shortly before Maud was born, Linder was working with the famed director Abel Gance, who a few years later would make his greatest masterpiece, Napoleon. Together, they made a short titled Au Secours, which would be released in June 1924. The box office performance was underwhelming, and the critics were critical. According to a New York Times article, Linder began making dark comments to friends, saying things like he had nothing left to live for. After he bought a revolver, his friends took it away from him, fearing what he might do with it, to which he replied that he knew a better way than that. In late October 1925, Linder and Nanette reportedly went to see the film Quo Vadis, in which two characters, Petronius and Eunice, commit suicide by bleeding themselves to death. Things started to get even worse with Linder, and Nanette wrote to her mother only days later, "He will kill me." Linder abruptly resigned as president of the French Society of Film Authors after only holding the position for 3 months. Then, when visiting a friend, he told him it would be their last meeting. Even with all of these obvious hints and implications, it seems that nobody was willing to do anything drastic to intervene. On the morning of November 1st, Mrs. Peters, Nanette's mother, having been told that Linder and her daughter were planning a trip to the countryside and wanting to wish them safe travels, called Linder's hotel room, but there was no answer. A porter informed her that Linder had forbidden all calls. Mrs. Peters went up to the room herself, and hotel staff forced the door open, and they discovered Linder and Nanette unconscious, bleeding profusely on their bed, though still alive. They were quickly rushed to a hospital, but Nanette died 7 hours later, and Linder also died afterwards. The deaths were reported as part of a suicide pact, and that was the official cause decided upon, but the details remain unconfirmed. Nanette's family did not believe that the young woman had wanted to die as Linder had. Though if that was true, one might wonder why she hadn't screamed for help. The most likely theory for this is that Nanette, resigned to her husband's determination for them to die together, eventually agreed to drink a sleeping potion that knocked her out so that she wouldn't feel any pain. Both had been injected with morphine and had drunk Veronal, the same drug they had used previously. But the extent to which Linder coerced Nanette into his fantasy of death, if he did, is unknown. Though according to the testimony of Nanette's doctor, Linder was extremely emotionally abusive towards her, and she was convinced that he would kill her. This suggests that under normal circumstances, she never would have willingly gone along with such an act. She probably felt like she had no way out, so she just accepted it. The whole story of Max Linder's decline is confusing and complicated, filled with rumors and sketchy details. Perhaps his mental decline was due to something horrific he experienced during the war. Or perhaps it was caused by his declining career and his inability to regain the stardom that he once had, despite still being held in high regard. Or perhaps it was due to some personal flaw that led to viciousness. We will never know for certain. And then there was also their daughter Maud, who was less than 2 years old when they died. She went on to write extensively about her father's life, and fairly successfully revived his legacy in film, at least in France, and died in 2017 at the age of 93. Unfortunately, Max Linder's morbid end overshadows much of what he accomplished in his career and his contributions to the film industry. It's a shame that such a talent had to go down such a dark path and drag his wife down with him. The next person is Martha Mansfield. She's a lesser-known celebrity, but the story of her death is truly tragic, though it didn't get nearly as much attention in the media as you might expect. Martha Mansfield was born Martha Ehrlich, but she was unsatisfied with her last name for her career, so she changed it to Mansfield, which was the name of the Ohio town where her mother had lived after immigrating from Ireland. She dabbled in many kinds of jobs in the art and entertainment world, first going on Broadway, then becoming an artist model before starting her film career on the East Coast. Her first films in 1917 were alongside another ill-fated actor, Max Linder. The next year, she joined the Ziegfeld Follies, then shortly afterward decided to move to Hollywood to further pursue a movie career there. Her first Hollywood movie was released in 1920, and her first real breakthrough movie was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that same year, where she appeared alongside the illustrious actor John Barrymore. She also found some success with the 1923 movie The Silent Command, which featured Bela Lugosi. Also in 1923, she received the lead female role in The Warrens of Virginia, a Civil War-era romance drama, and filming commenced at Brackenridge Park in San Antonio, Texas. For her role, Mansfield had to wear a large Civil War-era frilly hoop skirt dress, a crinoline to be exact. After finishing her parts for the day, Mansfield went to her car. The following events are a bit foggy, but somehow a used match landed near Mansfield's dress, setting it on fire. Newspapers reported that someone else involved in the filming had lit a cigarette with the match, then tossed it, and it happened to land right on Mansfield. The flames spread quickly. Those nearby rushed to help her. Co-star Wilfred Lytell threw his jacket over her in an attempt to snuff out the fire, sparing her further burns to her face and neck. And the driver of Mansfield's car suffered severe burns to his right hand while trying to help her. The flames were eventually put out, but not before Mansfield had suffered horrific burns. She was still alive, however, and was rushed to a hospital to be treated. Some newspapers published optimistic blurbs about her recovery, as well as the director's comment that filming for The Warrens of Virginia was set to continue after her recovery. One report said that she would be able to recover in a week or possibly 10 days. But her injuries proved to be too serious, and she died at 11:50 a.m. on November 30th, 1923. She was only 24 years old. She had barely even begun her Hollywood career by the time of her death, and would likely have become more popular if she had been able to continue. Among the pallbearers at her funeral were David Selznick and Samuel Goldwyn. No one knows exactly where the match came from, and there were never any reports or indications that anyone was sought in connection for the negligence. So it's very possible that someone had to live for decades with that on their conscience, but we'll never know who they were. There's also a different narrative that perhaps Mansfield herself had discarded the fatal match. To make the tragedy even worse, her last film, The Warrens of Virginia, is now a lost film. Filming had been completed without Mansfield, and was eventually released the following year, though Mansfield's part was not used as the female lead, replaced instead with co-star Rosemary Hill. Of course, one reason for this was that the filming had not been completed before she died, though it had almost been finished. But it was probably more of a financial consideration. As a writer for the Los Angeles Times noted, "Few, if any, posthumous pictures like those of Harold Lockwood or Olive Thomas have ever been favored." Unfortunately, Martha Mansfield is known more for her grisly death than for her movies. Her career was sadly very short, but just like Olive Thomas, she can still be briefly brought back to life with the small number of films from her career that have survived and are available. The next person on this list is known to pretty much everyone, whether or not they know anything about history: Harry Houdini. Born in Austria-Hungary, Houdini's real name was Erich Weiss. His family moved to America when he was 4 years old. In his early career as a magician, Weiss created the stage name Harry Houdini, derived from the name of Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, a master magician that Houdini greatly admired. He began his career in entertainment as a performer in circuses, sideshows, and vaudeville performing card tricks, then moved on to escape acts. He first gained fame for being able to escape from handcuffs, then straitjackets. He also began performing more ambitious and potentially life-ending stunts as well. His most popular and dangerous act was called the Chinese water torture cell. For this act, he would be lowered into a glass tank filled with water, then locked inside. To escape, he had to hold his breath for a very long time, more than 3 minutes. When the 1920s rolled around, Houdini was still very famous, and continued to perform his feats of endurance despite being middle-aged by that point. He also appeared in a few films, which made good use of his unusual ability to escape from practically anything. He also became very interested in debunking the spiritualist movement. He thought that many mediums took advantage of vulnerable people to make money, and wanted to put a stop to that. This crusade became the second most important public act for him, and his comments on the subject were widely published. And he was part of a group that offered money to anyone who could prove to them conclusively that they had a supernatural ability. Houdini had plenty of insider knowledge about how someone could create the illusion that they had special abilities, and he let the public behind the curtain to see how such tricks were performed. Because to him, so-called mediums and others in that sphere were just performers, and some of these performers wanted to mislead people for selfish purposes. On October 19th, as he was still recovering from a fractured bone in his foot, Houdini gave a presentation about spiritualist tricks in Montreal, Canada to a group of students at the Princess Theatre. In a more informal gathering with a small group of the students in his dressing room after the presentation, Houdini remarked in response to a question that his stomach muscles were very strong and could be struck without serious injury to him. The man who had asked the question took this as a challenge and punched Houdini in the stomach twice as he was reclining on a divan, and he didn't hold back. Houdini was taken by surprise and couldn't prepare his abs before he was struck. At the time, Houdini didn't appear seriously injured, though he was probably a bit startled. Later, while on a train, he complained of pain, and he was taken to a doctor in Detroit, Michigan, who told Houdini that it looked like it could be appendicitis, and left it up to him whether he would continue with his planned performance that night at the Garrick Theatre. Houdini, ever the showman, chose to go on with the show. But due to his condition, he didn't perform as well as he usually did. According to one audience member, Houdini was at least half an hour late and had to be supported by his assistants at times, and he was just in bad form overall. After the performance, he was in even greater pain and was taken to Grace Hospital to undergo emergency surgery for appendicitis. It had been 3 days since he was punched. After the operation, he also developed sepsis, further complicating his recovery, though his condition was still fair. The doctors used an experimental new serum for the first time on Houdini, but it didn't work nearly as well as was hoped. The fact that he was in top physical condition certainly helped improve his chances, and a less fit man might have already succumbed by then. But there were many other problems completely out of anyone's control. The doctors later said that he was one of the best patients they ever had. A second operation was performed to try and fix the paralysis of his bowels, but his condition only worsened. He continued to languish. As the New York Times noted of his worsening infection, identified at the time as Streptococcus peritonitis, few cases are known to the medical profession where persons suffering from it have recovered. It became clear to the doctors that Houdini's chances for survival were very, very slim, and he died on October 31st, 1926. It was quickly determined that it was the 2 punches that had burst his appendix in the first place. And while it has never been 100% confirmed who that man was, there was later witness testimony indicating that it was a 31-year-old McGill University student named Jocelyn Gordon Whitehead, but he was never legally held liable for Houdini's death. Technically, it has never been proven that the punches caused Houdini's appendicitis. It is possible that the timing was a coincidence, but for most, the timing was too coincidental, so the logical conclusion is made that the 2 events must have been connected. Of course, now it's far too late to confirm anything. Harry Houdini remains one of, if not the most famous magician of all time. His name is known everywhere, and it's a shame that a random guy felt the urge to wail on him without warning. Enrico Caruso had been one of the earliest stars of recorded music, being one of the most renowned and well-known opera singers of his time. Originally from Naples, Italy, Caruso had become a sensation, first on the stage, then on record. With little exaggeration, his name was ubiquitous all around the Western world. But in the last part of his life, Caruso was plagued with illness. It started in mid-1919 with persistent migraines. Then, in December 1920, while performing in Samson and Delilah, a pillar from the set fell on him. Less than a week later, he slipped on stage and fell on his side and was injured. But the most dramatic incident happened on December 11th. He had just started singing the first notes of his performance when a blood vessel in his throat burst. He hesitated, then continued singing, with blood continuing to trickle down his throat, making it difficult to sing. After a short time, his wife, seated close by at one of the wings, noticed that something was wrong and gestured for him to stop the performance. Caruso refused, using up his handkerchief and the handkerchiefs of the other performers until they were covered with his own blood. His doctor was brought to the theater, and he too tried to tell Caruso to stop, but again he refused and ended up finishing the performance. After this episode, Caruso would perform a couple more times. During a Christmas Eve performance, he appeared in pain while performing and was clutching his side. Shortly after his final performance, he fell ill with pleurisy, along with pneumonia. Between December 31st, 1920 and March 25th, 1921, Caruso had 6 surgeries performed on him, many of them in order to drain fluid, and his condition became critical in early February 1921. After the 4th surgery on March 1st and a blood transfusion on March 12th, he appeared to be recovering very well and even appeared in public again. He was taking walks, chatting with friends, and telling jokes again. It seemed like Caruso's stubbornness and motivation to keep going had won. He had said previously, when he was seriously ill in New York, that if he were to die, he would rather die in Italy. Sometimes it seemed that Caruso refused to believe that he was sick. In his last interview in the fall of 1921, after the reporter noticed that he was smoking a cigar, Caruso exclaimed, "Of course I smoke. What do you think, that I am sick?" He also briefly demonstrated his singing voice for an informal audience. Caruso was confident that he would beat his illnesses and make a triumphant return to the stage. But when the pain in his side shot up suddenly less than 2 months into his convalescence, his family had to scramble to find a doctor. One had not been attached to his group. An abscess between his liver and stomach was discovered by the new attending doctor. But Caruso stayed in Sorrento for 3 more days before it became evident that he needed to be taken away to Rome for further treatment. But after arriving in Naples, his condition worsened, and he couldn't get to Rome. At this point, his heart had been damaged, and he became completely bedridden. Doctors had to treat him in his hotel room. He drifted in and out of consciousness. At 5 a.m. on August 2nd, 1921, he reportedly said his last words, "I'm not rising up this time. It is over." 4 hours later, he died. His death was mourned all across the world as the passing of a musical legend. It's hard to emphasize enough the ripples that his death caused. The newspapers had covered his health condition extensively whenever there was any kind of update. And looking at the coverage in the issue of the New York Times after Caruso's death shows just how important he was to so many people. Unlike most other celebrities who got a column of coverage in the newspaper when they died, Caruso got full pages in tribute. His widow accused some of the doctors handling his case of being at fault for his worsened condition, and the doctors themselves threw blame around. But of course, by that point, it was all too late. Hypotheticals have been speculated on in the many years after Caruso's death, and it's generally believed that, under the right circumstances, he could have been saved. But due to bad timing, a slow diagnosis, and other such factors, it had all ended in tragedy. Not long before his death, he had related a story to the reporter in his last interview, and I think it's a rather positive way to end this segment. He said, "One night I dreamed I was dead. It was when my illness was at its height. I seemed to be buried, and strangely enough could at the same time see my bas-relief carved on the top of my tombstone. It seemed so calm and peaceful, no more suffering. A loud automobile horn in the street below brought me back to life, and I woke up to find Mrs. Caruso looking anxiously into my face. I told her one experience beyond the grave would be sufficient for me for some time, and from that moment I have been improving. It's very agreeable to be dead, but it's a great deal nicer to be alive." President Warren G. Harding had one of the most infamous administrations in American history. Many have probably heard his name before, but maybe don't know much about him except for the Teapot Dome scandal. But while he was president, he was fairly popular. Much of that notoriety came later, after his death. In hindsight, he has been consistently ranked throughout the past 5 decades in the lowest quartile of US presidents based on their overall performance. This places him alongside forgettable names such as Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. In the summer of 1923, President Harding was making a tour of the west coast of the US as well as Canada and the US territory of Alaska on what was dubbed the Voyage of Understanding. This made him the first sitting US president to visit Canada and Alaska. The tour kicked off in the wake of revelations of corruption among people he had appointed to office, which was bound to cause problems soon. First, Harding arrived in Seattle in July and spent time admiring the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest. While in Alaska, he made a long speech in the surprisingly sweltering heat reaching well into the 90s. Throughout the first weeks of his visit, he seemed to be in a good mood, though while traveling, the stress of recent events had made him frustrated. He had become aware of the corruption that would eventually explode into the Teapot Dome scandal, as well as another scandal involving the Veterans Bureau. He asked his Secretary of Commerce and future President Herbert Hoover about the corruption in his administration. Hoover later wrote that he told him if he were in Harding's place, he thought it would be best to expose the corruption publicly. Then the president's honor could be saved. But there would never be a chance for Harding to do that, even if he had wanted to. Coupled with this stress, Harding was also in poor health. In particular, he was found to have an enlarged heart. Additionally, he might also have been sick with food poisoning after eating seafood. His last speeches of the trip were poorly given, and he looked weak and frail according to later reports. His condition reached such a point that he was taken to San Francisco, and a few planned stops in California were canceled. He was taken to the Palace Hotel to rest and receive medical treatment. Despite abdominal pain, Harding seemed to be making a recovery before he took a sharp turn for the worse. Around 7 p.m. on August 2nd, 1923, his wife Florence was reading a magazine article to him as he was in bed in the Palace Hotel. It was a positive article about him in the Saturday Evening Post. Florence stopped reading for a moment, and Harding said, "That's good. Go on, read some more." Almost immediately after that, he slumped back in intense pain and lost consciousness. Attempts were made to revive him by his doctors, but with no success, and he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. At the time, Harding's cause of death was listed as a stroke, though it's now generally accepted that it was a heart attack. Florence refused to have an autopsy performed, likely because it had been obvious that Harding had been in ill health and she didn't want his body to be probed. But of course, this decision has been scrutinized by certain people as being part of some kind of conspiracy. And there's no real evidence to support the later claim that she poisoned him, and it never gained any traction. After Harding's death, some of the doctors who had attended to him were publicly attacked. Dr. Ray Lyman Wilbur, one of the doctors present at Harding's bedside, later wrote, "We, the doctors, were accused of starving the president to death, of feeding him to death, of assisting in slowly poisoning him, and of plying him to death with pills and purgatives. We were accused of being abysmally ignorant, stupid and incompetent, and even of malpractice." At the time of his death, Harding was still relatively popular with the public, and the nation mourned the loss of their president as the investigations into the scandals of members of his administration continued. As previously mentioned, Harding had learned about some of the corruption before he died, and was appalled, and certainly didn't approve or encourage it. And in his last days, he had been struggling with the question of what to do about it, and he felt betrayed by the friends he had appointed to government positions. No matter how much or how little blame you give to Harding personally, the fact remains that his presidency was forever tarnished, and Harding never even had a chance to defend himself publicly. The government's precarious relationship with Harding and all the baggage of his administration was clearly demonstrated by the very slow recognition of the Harding Memorial in his hometown of Marion, Ohio. It was completed in 1927, and the bodies of Warren and Florence Harding were interred, but the official dedication did not happen until 1931. Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, was in a rather awkward political situation and didn't bother to do it, so the task was left to Coolidge's successor, Herbert Hoover. Hoover had known Harding more closely than Coolidge, and was one of the few in the Republican Party who was willing to publicly speak positively about Harding after his death. Although many have understandably questioned Harding's judgment and who he appointed to government positions, it should be noted that he had also made some good appointments as well, and it wasn't his entire cabinet that was involved in the scandals. There have been efforts to restore some of Harding's reputation, at least as an individual, but I'm not so sure that they've been very successful overall. And whether he deserves it or not is up to you. Next, we have another US president, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is best remembered for being the president during World War I and eventually committing American troops to the conflict, as well as helping to create the League of Nations, which the United States didn't end up joining. By that time, Wilson had already had a few notable health problems, including 2 previous strokes, one in 1896 and another in 1906. They had both been relatively minor ones, but he had experienced some lasting side effects from them. Towards the end of his presidency, Wilson's health further declined. In April 1919, while he was in Paris during the Treaty of Versailles negotiations, he became sick with influenza, which caused him to have a terrible cough, and at the peak of his illness, he was delirious. A few months later, Wilson, back in the US, embarked on a nationwide speaking tour to secure support for ratification of the treaty by the US, an effort which ultimately failed. The schedule was hectic, and Wilson didn't have enough time to relax or exercise. But it had always been Wilson's habit to not rest much throughout his working life, and this eventually took a toll on his body. In late September, he was very ill again, and he returned to the White House. Shortly afterward, Wilson suffered a severe stroke, leaving his left side paralyzed and his right eye partially blind. This was kept from the public for a long time, and Wilson's wife, Edith, wanted to protect her husband from further illness. It is widely debated how much power she exercised during that critical time, as she controlled who could come in and see the president while he was bedridden. Even after a urinary tract infection and another bout of influenza, Wilson hung on. At the beginning of 1920, the public had become aware of his stroke, and more details came out. In mid-March 1920, he allowed the first photographs to be taken of him since his illness. The New York Times commented that he looked pretty fit, but his altered appearance did not go unnoticed. A few months later, in June, he posed for a photo with Edith in another demonstration of his ability to fulfill his duties. But notice that Edith is standing on his left side and holding the paper for him so he won't move it while writing, since he couldn't use his left hand to hold it down as usual. Wilson might have recovered somewhat, but he remained impaired for the rest of his presidency, which ended in March of 1921, and really for the rest of his life. He expressed interest in running for a third term in the 1920 election, but was quickly talked out of it by his wife and close friends. He opened a law practice in 1921 with a partner, but wasn't involved much in the day-to-day operations due to his health, and it closed the next year. Wilson didn't write a memoir, but did provide information for a lengthy biography of him. Wilson's successor as president, Warren G. Harding, ended up dying suddenly on August 2, 1923. Up until shortly before his death, Harding had seemed relatively healthy, and he was almost 9 years younger than Wilson. Considering Wilson's long history of health problems, it was surprising that he had lasted as long as he had. He hadn't been able to attend Harding's inauguration, but did attend his funeral. On November 10, 1923, he gave a speech on Armistice Day from his home over the radio. This was to be his last public address. Unlike most of the other people on this list, Wilson's death was unspectacular and not unexpected. It was far more surprising that he hadn't died sooner. His health gradually declined in the last few months of his life, and he died quietly in his sleep on February 3, 1924, almost exactly 5 months after Harding had died. This meant that the only surviving ex-president at the time was William Howard Taft. According to the New York Times article from the following day, one of the last things Wilson said was, "I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machinery is broken, I am ready." And his last word was his wife's name, Edith. He was interred at the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and he remains the only president whose final resting place is in the nation's capital. Whatever you think about Wilson as a president or a person, you have to admit that he had an unusually strong work ethic and a stubborn will and determination to push on, no matter what happened to him. The next person was closely associated with the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. Lord Carnarvon was, as you might have guessed by his title, born into a prominent and wealthy British family. He was involved in a serious car accident in the very early days of the invention, all the way back in 1903. The injuries would last in some form for the rest of his life. Due to these injuries, a doctor recommended that he recuperate somewhere abroad during winter, so Lord Carnarvon and his wife went to Egypt, where he quickly became interested in Egyptology, a fairly common hobby for wealthy European men at the time. In 1907, Lord Carnarvon funded an excavation in Egypt where he met Howard Carter. The two men continued to work together, and even jointly wrote a book about their findings. In 1914, they began their excavations of the Valley of the Kings, where many Egyptian pharaohs' tombs had already been discovered. It was generally believed that there was little of interest left to be found, though they were both especially keen on finding the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. After years of searching, they had turned up little. Lord Carnarvon decided that 1922 would be the last year he would sponsor excavation efforts there. But on November 4th of that year, at the 11th hour, Carter sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon saying that he had discovered a tomb. Less than 3 weeks later, Lord Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, arrived at the site. A few days later, Carter was able to peer into the tomb through a small hole he had made, resulting in the famous exchange when Lord Carnarvon asked, "Do you see anything?" To which Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." On March 19, 1923, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito on his right cheek while in the Valley of the Kings, then accidentally cut the wound with a razor blade while shaving. He apparently didn't think it was anything to be concerned about, but he would quickly find out how serious it really was. The wound immediately became infected and eventually developed into blood poisoning in the head and neck. Only 2.5 weeks later, on April 5th, he died at a hotel in Cairo, Egypt, and his body was sent back to England to be buried. His death is closely associated with the so-called mummy's curse. There was a belief among some people that ancient Egyptians had used magic spells that would curse anyone who stepped foot in a pharaoh's sacred tomb. A less supernatural idea was that the ancient Egyptians had placed poison in the tomb to kill intruders. One clue that people pointed to was that Howard Carter had written to a friend a few days before Lord Carnarvon's death, "This tomb has brought us bad luck." In the 1920s, there were still many superstitions, and the spiritualist movement remained fairly popular throughout much of the decade. One of the leaders of the spiritualist movement was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was quoted as saying, "A malevolent spirit may have caused Lord Carnarvon's fatal illness." He went on to say, "I think it is possible that some occult influence caused his death. There are many legends about the powers of the old Egyptians, and I know I wouldn't care to go fooling about their tombs and mummies. There have been other instances of persons who met with unfortunate ends under similar circumstances. We know that all the powers of the ancient Egyptians were used to guard their mummies, and they must have had great powers. Of course, I don't say that some Egyptian spirit did kill Carnarvon, but I think it is possible. There are many malevolent spirits. There was a mummy in the British Museum which became noted because of the series of misfortunes which befell those who had anything to do with it. The excavators, the workmen who carried it, the photographers who photographed it, and others seemed to be pursued by an evil influence. Virtually everyone in the Egyptology and academic spheres quickly dismissed such beliefs in the mummy's curse, pointing to a long list of archaeologists who had excavated ancient Egyptian tombs and had nothing bad happen to them. The best example for this is Howard Carter, who was in the same place at the same time as Lord Carnarvon, and had even gone so far as to look upon the face of the dead King Tut, something that Lord Carnarvon had not been able to do. In a 1934 letter, Carter claimed that the pharaoh's curse story was invented by a journalist and rival Egyptologist named Arthur Weigel. Carter called the curse rumor Tommy Rot. Regardless, the story of the curse will always be connected with Lord Carnarvon's death, even if there was no truth to it. In the end, the tale of the mummy's curse was just a more interesting one than a simple infected mosquito bite. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb was an international sensation, and while Lord Carnarvon wasn't constantly excavating at the site like Carter, he played a very important role by making it all possible through his wealth and patience. But unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to experience just how influential the discovery became. If you've made it to the end, thank you for watching, and I hope all the new parts were better than the originals. I just hope that in the future, I can get it right the first time. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.